Good afternoon, everyone, and welcome to session 2 of our HS2 Archaeology Conference Day. So this session is all about death and burial in ancient Britain. And I do need to warn you that the video you're going to watch will contain images and samples of human remains talked about in detail. So do be warned that there will be images of human remains. I'm going to play the lecture in a moment, and I know that Jackie is very, very good at relating complicated terms, so she'll explain any of that. Some of you may well recognise Jackie. She was the consultant expert on Time Team, the Channel 4 television series, for all the human remains that were found during those excavations. So I'm going to pop that lecture on now. I hope you enjoy it. Thanks, everyone.
Greetings, my name is Jacqueline McKinley, also known as Jackie, and I'm the Principal Osteoarchaeologist here at Wessex Archaeology. And today I'm going to be talking to you about HS2 and the mortuary rite of cremation. The parts of the HS2 route covered by Wessex Archaeology extends through Warwickshire and up into Staffordshire, so that's to the southwest of Coventry and the east of Birmingham, so we really are well and truly in the Midlands. Whilst the various sections of the overall route have encountered cemeteries and burial remains of various forms, date and number, the mortuary deposits encountered in our investigations have all featured cremated remains. Now, the choice of term here, mortuary rather than burial deposits, is deliberate for reasons which hopefully will become apparent. The common image which springs to mind when people think of where the dead are placed in the landscape is that of a cemetery. A group of graves within a given location, assuming a communal gathering together of the dead. Now, obviously, size can vary depending on the date of the cemetery. For example, you might have a later medieval or a post-medieval cemetery, and that's 1066 to about 1800 AD. And they can extend to several thousand burial remains, compared with, for instance, a Bronze Age Barrow cemetery, so we're looking at somewhere between 2200 to 700 BC, containing a few dozen or less. Organisation can also vary. You could see, for instance, the orderly rows of a Middle Saxon field cemetery, such as we have here. The rectangular features that you can see there are rows down that middle bit. They are the graves. The more circular features that you can see towards the edges there are tree throws. This is where a tree's gone over and it leaves a feature in the ground that we can see archaeologically. So these kinds of cemeteries, or later medieval and post-medieval churchyards, or more, those were quite orderly. It can vary from those kinds of things to the apparently more randomly distributed grave groups, as seen in many prehistoric, Romano-British and early medieval or earlier Anglo-Saxon cemeteries. These quite often feature several foci, representative of family or maybe kinship groups, and sometimes a bit of both, as we can see in this image here. This is a Romano-British cemetery. You can see you've got quite orderly rows in that bit that's inside that rectangular enclosure, but outside it's a little bit more disorganised and dispersed. And again, as with the size of the cemetery, these variations can reflect something of the date of the cemetery and the density of population using it. A very broad comparison would be urban cemeteries compared with rural. This gives you a broad comparison. And it also reflects the levels of control effected over their use. Those orderly rows, somebody has to order them. It isn't just up to where you decide you're going to bury your dead or how close you're going to put somebody next to their grandma or their uncle. It was organised. However, many of the burial remains we encounter archaeologically, particularly throughout prehistory, are not found in cemeteries as such. Many comprise singletons or lone graves, often located close to ditches, comprising field boundaries, or they may occur within small groups of less than 10 graves. The latter are likely to represent small family groups associated with similarly small settlements or individual farmsteads. And both these small groups and the singletons often appear to lie in what we call liminal locations, towards the edge or the boundaries of individual cemeteries. Now, this does not mean they're out of sight and out of mind. They are within view of the living. The dead and the living did not get separated in the kind of way that we may think of. But their graves are potentially forming markers to areas of land occupation, or they could have been acting as guardians to a claimed area of land. The mortuary remains from the 6 sites along the route of HS2 investigated by Wessex Archaeology fell within these latter categories, singletons or very small groups of mortuary-related deposits, not all of which are currently dated or securely dated to a specific period. We're in the early stages of work on this material. It's been excavated, it's come back here, but we don't always know exactly what period they date to, so we're awaiting radiocarbon dating. Now, the earliest remains were recovered from Ricknielsteed in Staffordshire, where we had the remains of an early Bronze Age, that's 2200 to about 1600 BC, urn cremation burial, and 2 other deposits, probably of Middle Bronze Age date, so that's 1600 to 1100 BC. And again, these were actually of uncertain type. Now, by this, I mean they probably did not form burial deposits as such, but some other form of cremation-related deposit. The primary stage of the cremation rite, for which we have unequivocal archaeological evidence, is the cremation itself, the process by which the corpse and its accompanying materials are transformed by that life-sustaining but at the same time dangerous and destructive element of fire from one state to another. And if you look at this image, you can see what we've got here is an image from an early Bronze Age Greek urn. And look at the structure here. The structure is this lattice-work structure, supports the body. Now, I know this one looks a bit odd because the chap on here seems to be making his own sort of offering on his pyre, but that structure is something we see replicated in images from the ancient Greek through the Roman and throughout sort of historical periods into modern day Indian cremations that are undertaken on the side of the Ganges. But I think what you can see also from the second image here is that magic of the living flame, how that might have been seen by people in the past as moving, giving heat, giving light, and going up into the heavens. Now, what remains at the end of cremation, the dehydrated and oxidized remains. Now, by this, it's usually mostly the bone. Bone is about 70% mineral and 30% organic. So what you're doing when you're cremating is getting rid of all the organics and leaving the oxidized remains, the calcined remains of the bone. So what is left at the end of cremation is now portable, divisible, and inert. All quite important factors. And burial of all, or more commonly in the past, some of these remains is very much a secondary rite, which might not always have occurred. And how many of us now retain the cremated remains of a loved one, sometimes for years, before finally scattering their ashes in a significant location within the landscape or at sea? So if we do that now, it's not surprising people would have done it in the past as well. I'll return to the complex nature of the mortuary rite of cremation later, but for now, sufficient to say that it's often apparent that only a proportion of the cremated remains were subject to what we would classify as a formal burial. Some of the bone could be retained for other forms of disposal or use, and some of it was left with fuel ash. That's the remnants of the pyre turned pyre debris, which itself could be disposed of in various locations, either formally or simply as part of a tidying up process. So they'd clear the site, and if there was an open feature, they would maybe throw it in that open feature, a ditch or a pit that already existed, or sometimes, particularly in Romano-British urban cemeteries, it was just piled up in one area of the cemetery. Hence, not all deposits of material containing cremated remains will represent the remains of a burial, and not all holes in the ground containing such materials will represent a grave. Hence my use of the expression mortuary rite rather than burial rites, because the use of the latter term misses out at least half the story. The remains from Cubbington and Coleshill all seem likely to be late Iron Age or Romano-British in date, largely on the basis of their proximity to field systems and possibly settlement structures of this date. Now, as I've not yet seen the material recovered from the 15 features at Coleshill, I can say very little about them, but the nature of the 2 small deposits from Cubbington is unclear. And by small, I really do mean small. I'm talking about a handful of bone only. Now, this is when a cremated adult would be expected to give 1,600 to 3,500 grams of bone, I might have less than 100 grams. So what we have in general to look at is only about 6% of what would have existed. The question is where the rest of it is and what type of deposit is therefore represented. However, these deposits from Cubbington and Coleshill, their location in close proximity to the apparent settlement area is of interest and could provide insights into the dynamics operational between the living and the dead, presumably their own dead. There is evidence from some prehistoric periods in particular to suggest a shift in the function of the dead in relation to the living post-transformation. Now, by that I mean by cremation or maybe by excarnation of the unburnt corpse by various mechanisms. And this could be defleshing, exposure, or burial and then re-excavation of the defleshed material that's decomposed in the ground. This sort of material and this transformation process led to their placement in specific locations in the landscape, acting maybe as intermediaries with the gods or the other world, or perhaps as guardians of the living. Alternatively, in the case of Cubbington, the location of these remains could simply signal a change in land use from occupation to mortuary use or vice versa. This is where we need to get the radiocarbon dates. The again very small quantities of bone, and this is 100 grams or less, recovered from the 3 features believed to be Romano-British date at River Lean, are likely to include the remains of at least one urn-urn cremation burial, as is one of the 3 undated deposits from Kenilworth. The Anglo-Saxon period, in which the rite of cremation was practised almost exclusively in the early part, that's the 5th to the early 6th century, with a marked shift to inhumation burial thereafter, is one in which the remains of cremation burial are rarely found outside cemeteries, making the singleton from Crewe Farm appear quite unusual. The burial had been made urned, that's inside a ceramic vessel, and grave goods in the form of a glass bead and an amber bead were found in the grave. Now, I believe my colleague Lorraine Mepham is going to tell you about this in her presentation. The point of interest here is that these items, representing items of personal ornamentation, and that's jewellery to you and me, and as such are soon to be worn by the deceased on the pyre, the same way I'm wearing my jewellery now, were not burnt, suggesting they were placed in the urn at the time of burial rather than lying on the body during cremation. Now, amber being an organic substance would likely to be consumed by the fire, whereas a glass bead would likely show signs of melting if on the pyre. Now, experiments have shown that pyres would have achieved temperatures of 700 to 1,000 degrees centigrade, in other words, equivalent to what you see in modern cremators. And if we look at this image here, you can see a comparison in the kinds of temperatures you see. What we see in the modern cremation is a variety of cremations taking place. That isn't all one, whereas what we're seeing from the pyre is just one cremation taking place. You will notice there's a lot of variation over time and whereabouts we're taking the readings on the pyre as to the temperature achieved. This is because there's wind and the wind's blowing the air from side to side, cooling parts of the pyre, heating other parts up. You get hotter temperatures towards the top, cooler towards the bottom because hot air rises. But what you will note is that the overall temperatures that we're working with are the same both on the pyre and in modern cremators. Now, as Anglo-Saxon glass would have melted within the same range of temperatures that we're seeing here, dependent on the additives to give it colour, then that's why we would expect to see melted glass. A more conclusive understanding of whether these items really did comprise pyre goods, i.e. placed on the body on the pyre at the time, or grave goods added only at the time of burial, and what other factors might have affected their condition, might have been achieved if their location within the burial had been known, i.e. the context, which is vital when you're trying to do interpretation of things like this. But alas, as with all the deposits excavated as part of these investigations, these Anglo-Saxon burial remains from Crewe Farm have been subject to substantial horizontal truncation, leaving only about 4 centimetres depth intact. So we're talking about really quite a small amount. Now, if we look at this fantastic Romano-British vessel that we can see here, now this is not from HS2, alas, and we don't often get ones quite this big. They're normally about half the size, and quite often they have been truncated. But if you can imagine, I've got bone occurring to that height within this vessel. If I'd only got the lower few centimetres, you can see how much of that burial deposit might have been lost. And with it would have been the contents. So it wouldn't leave an awful lot in the ground. The level of truncation could also be why these Anglo-Saxon remains appear as such a singular singleton. Other similar deposits could have been ploughed away entirely, and we could have been left with a false impression of the numbers that were originally buried here. Now, the mortuary rite of cremation was in use in the British Isles since the Mesolithic period, so we're going back 8,500 to 4,000 BC. The evidence is very sparse. From England, we only have about 2 examples that have been securely dated so far. There are a few more in Scotland and Ireland. In the Neolithic period, so we're talking about 4,000 to 2,200 BC, it's also relatively sparse, but tended to increase towards the later phases. And again, there's more examples from Scotland and Ireland. And these will occur in places like Long Barrows, where you get lots of disarticulated, unburnt human bone. It would have gone in originally, we think, articulated, but become disarticulated later. And sometimes you find small deposits of cremated bone in there, for instance. In the Bronze Age, so from 2200 to 700 BC, cremation as a rite was used throughout, but it fluctuates in frequency. You get the use of ceramic vessels, of urns. They're called urns both in type, so it's an urn is the type of vessel we're seeing, but also in function, i.e. it acted as a container for the cremated remains. So you get both urned burials and unurned burials. In the Middle Bronze Age, you get some very large cemeteries of up to 100 or more. There's quite a group of them from Dorset, for instance, on the gravels down there. But more often than not, you get small groups of maybe 10, 20, 30, up to 50 burials occurring in some of these cemeteries, as well as all the singletons. In the later Iron Age, so that's from 100 BC onwards, there is a geographical division in the use of cremation. In the southeast, cremation was used in the later Iron Age. It was a native tradition, whereas in the northwest, sort of a line going up through the Midlands, it was not so common and really only came into use when the Romans arrived and brought that rite with them. In the Romano-British period, cremation used to be seen almost exclusively as an early rite, so that's about 43 to 120 AD, but the use of radiocarbon dating has shown that actually it clung on in places. It still occurred. Quite often it was more common in towns as opposed to rural locations. It was very common in the northern frontier forts. And what we think is like to be happening here is there is a German connection or a Germanic connection, because that part of the empire, the northern German part of the empire, cremation continued to be used throughout the Roman occupation. And what you would have is people moving probably as part of the military into Britain and bringing their own rite with them. In this period, you could get the use of various vessel types for burial. So you could have a ceramic vessel, as the one we've seen here. They also would use glass vessels, and sometimes metal vessels would be used. And you could get earned or unearned burials taking place. And you could get some very large cemeteries, for instance, like this one at Wall that we can see. Wall is a little bit further up into Staffordshire. And you can see that you've got burials taking place either side of a road, which is a fairly typical location for cemeteries of this date. In the early Anglo-Saxon period, it's very common. You get some very, very large cemeteries of several thousands of burials taking place. And as you go into the 6th century, there's a shift to inhumation with no return in the use of the rite until the late 1900s, when we started to use it in modern Britain, the exception being the few Norse or late Iron examples we have. As I said, there are some very large cemeteries in the early part of the 5th centuries. These are normally in the East and East Anglia. And what we think is happening here is as these new people come in from the continent and start settling here, they kind of clump together. And we think the cremations themselves, that is the first part of the rite, the pyres, are being undertaken in the individual settlements, and what people are doing are gathering the remains together, remember, portable, divisible, and they are carrying them to a communal cemetery. So these people, these incomers, these new people are grouping themselves together in the early phases of their occupation. They're grouping their dead together. Later on, as they relax, get easier about their occupation here, you get more small, localised cemeteries occurring. Throughout the use of cremation, it's all obviously basically the same process. It's the attendant trappings that varied. It's still a process of oxidation and dehydration of the body's organic components, leaving that 70% mineral component of the bone. In order to undertake this, you need sufficient temperature, it's about 600 to 1000 degrees centigrade. You need sufficient oxygen. Without oxygen, you will get reducing conditions and it'll just char, it won't burn. You need to have that oxygen there, and you need enough time, especially with an open pyre, because so much heat is lost as the air rises. And so you also need enough fuel and that structure that we saw the image of. The analysis of cremated bone has various aims. The first obviously will be demographic. We want to know how many people there are in each one of the assemblages and their age and sex. Now you might think it's obvious, but it isn't obvious, because the minimum number of individuals, as we call it, within any one deposit can be one, most commonly, but you can get parts of more than one individual in one deposit. You can also get parts of one individual spread between separate deposits. So it's not always straightforward. Now, the ease with which this can be affected depends on several criteria. Firstly, the quantity of bone in the deposit, and that is really very, very, very variable. You could have just a few hundred grams, or you could have several thousand grams of bone. This is partly reflective of the amount of bone that was collected for burial in the first place. It also reflects something of the level of truncation, and we talked earlier about the truncation of the Anglo-Saxon vessels at River Leen, and also on taphonomic processes. A second factor is the degree of fragmentation, and this is greatly affected by post-depositional factors. So that might include the mode of burial, if it's urned or unearned. An urn will quite often give you greater protection from the burial environment than an unearned deposit would get. It also can depend on the depth of the grave. This big Roman vessel that we've had here, we don't, that obviously was in a very deep grave, but an awful lot of cremation graves that we find are, on average, I would say about 20 centimetres deep. So that's only about half that depth. Also, not only can you get horizontal truncation or plough going through the middle of this, but a pressure that is exerted on that cremated bone, which is incredibly brittle. I mean, it does almost fall apart just looking at it. That can break the bone up even further, and this is breakage along dehydration fissures formed during the cremation process into which soil can penetrate, and the soil type is very important. For instance, if we look at this image here, you can see, for instance, we have got one image showing an urned burial into which no soil has managed to infiltrate. So that's what it would have looked like when it went in the ground. You've got nice big pieces there. If you look at the second image, we've got still quite big pieces, but you can see there's soil gone in there and it's infiltrated into the dehydration fissures. That will get wet, dry, expand, contract, and as we move it, no matter how careful we are, it's going to break up along those dehydration fissures. And then you get the third image, which looks a bit horrid, I know, but that is where you have got not only some truncation, you've got soil infiltration, but you've got an acidic soil, something like a clay. And that really does not do the mineral component of the bone any good at all. It breaks it up. So the other factor obviously is disturbance, which we've looked at once already. And of course, the other thing is the excavation and post-excavation treatment. As I mentioned, cremated bone is extremely brittle and it's easily subject to additional fragmentation if it's too brutally treated during excavation, or if somebody packages it up with a whole load of other things to bring back to the office and dumps a load of heavy rocks or something on top of it. It makes my job much harder, as you can imagine. So it is very brittle stuff. So what I'm showing you here is the ideal situation. This is what I love. This I can work with so easily. As you can see, what I've done here is I've laid out, this is a Bronze Age teenage girl, and I could identify 85% of the bone that I got from there to skeletal element, which enabled me to lay her out in anatomical position. Great, fantastic. Sometimes we get the whole of, say, the frontal bone, which you can see over on the side there. There's the whole of the frontal just above the eye sockets and a whole tooth. Sadly, that doesn't always work like that. If I show you these things here, for instance, right, okay, this here, this isn't from Ricknell Street, but you can see this is from another Bronze Age site, and I've got nice big pieces of bone. These are vertebra. These are the vertebral bodies. They have survived beautifully. So I've got vertebra, I've got bits of the hip bone. So I can identify from these, I can tell something about the age of the individual because I can see where there's been fusion, where there's pathology that's come into it. This person here has got something called Schmall's nodes, for instance, which is where there's pressure from the intervertebral disc on the vertebral body itself. Now that's wonderful. Ricknell Street, this is what I've got to play with. And you can see these fragments are really very, very small. That is going to limit what I can say about the bone, how much I can identify to skeletal element. Although there's always brilliant fragments of cranial vault, which are quite easy to identify. And I'll talk about that a little bit more in a minute. So you can see I could get much less from one than from another. If I show you some of these images, for instance, this shows you the kind of things that I have to work with to identify numbers, minimum numbers of people. So your petrous temporal, that's basically your inner ear bone, the inner ear bone, very distinctive in appearance, very easy to recognise even as a small fragment. As are other parts of the skull, they're very distinctive. We've got mastoid processes, which sort of sit under here. They're muscle attachments, so they're sort of underneath where your ear is. So we've got other parts of the temporal region, the postglenoid tubercle and the articular tubercles, the articular tubercle being where your mandible articulates and stops it slipping forward out of place. They're very easily identifiable, but look how small they are. That's what I have to work with. That's what I have to be able to identify. So moving on briefly, pathology, right? Okay, we don't see a lot of pathology. We don't see as much as we do with unburnt remains, for instance, because of the various processes I've just described to you. But lesions will survive. Diagnosis is often limited due to incomplete skeletal recovery, and calculation of rates, where we have to see how many types of lesion we've got in a given area of the skeleton, for instance, is difficult or can be difficult or potentially misleading. And it's the nature of cremated bone, but we can see lesions. For instance, here we've got a number of dental lesions. You can see here a part of the maxilla, that's your upper jaw, where this person has lost quite a lot of teeth ante-mortem, either due to excess wear or probably due to caries lesions. There's impaction of, you might have to believe me on this one, but this is an impacted tooth that we can see in the other image here. You can also see evidence for some infections. The calcified lymph node that you can see here is actually quite rare. This is something that happens with tuberculosis. It does look like a bit of a bony baked bean, I know, but that's what they will look like. And also you can see changes of soft tissue infection where it's had an effect on the overlying bone, which is what we can see in this periostral new bone. Diseases which are related to advanced age. Degenerative diseases are very common in the spine. I showed you something which I called the Schmall's node earlier, but you get these kind of pressure defects which can show up, but also you can get signs of osteoarthritis, and that's what we've got in this top image. It's very small bones, but I can see that there's pitting in the surface, which tells me this person has osteoarthritis in the cervical, the neck area of their spine. And also they had degenerative disc disease in parts of their spine. That's something I've got this in my neck. It's a pain in the neck, but it doesn't stop me moving my neck. And Schmall's nodes. And also something rather odd here where you've got an osteoma, a new bone formation, where the mandible should actually articulate with the rest of the skull. You've got a new bone formation, which meant that basically wouldn't sit properly and would be disarticulated. So you can see evidence for pathology, and you can get an idea of how that might affect the person's lifestyle, but it can be quite limited. The mortuary rite of cremation involved a series of rituals, and what we're trying to deduce is what they did and why they did it. This is the ology bit, which I confess is what I find most exciting about working with cremated remains. Now, I could go on for hours about this, but I'm going to focus on a few areas of major importance. I mentioned the difference already between pyre goods and grave goods with respect to the Anglo-Saxon burial at Crewe Farm. One thing to remember is that not everything that went on the pyre will appear burnt. It depends where it was placed on the pyre and how long it stayed there. For instance, you might have items that were placed around the body, or you might have items that were placed on the body. Materials placed on the body could at some point have shifted and moved out of position, as could things placed around the body as the pyre collapsed. The way pyres collapse when they burn is they don't just sort of fall over and fall out. What tends to happen if it's burning efficiently is it will slowly drop down on itself, everything maintaining roughly the position it had to start with. But obviously things can slide to one side, they can move around a little bit. But items placed directly on the body would be insulated from the heat of the pyre in the early stages. The heat's coming from underneath. It will hit the body, which is just a solid body, so it will go around it. And the heat won't actually get to the top half of the body until later in the process, when some of the soft tissues and materials from underneath have burnt away and exposed them. And also, not everything that went on the pyre makes it into the grave. If you're only burying some of your cremated bone, you're not necessarily going to bury all the pyre goods as well. And there is evidence from some periods suggesting that when some materials had served their purpose as a pyre good, then the metal, for instance, might be collected for reuse. And sometimes some items will be deliberately left with the pyre debris rather than put into the grave. There's certainly evidence for this from the Roman period in France, where studies have been done. So pyre goods could be artifactual or animal remains. Now, they varied in frequency and form through time, and these materials can help date the remains, and as my colleague Lorraine Mepham will probably have discussed, but in the absence of man-made objects, that is the artifacts, you can sometimes tell the date from the species of animal that are included. In the Bronze Age period, for instance, you didn't get an awful lot of animals going on there. They were usually animals such as sheep, sometimes birds. So it looks like food items are going on there. Later on, when you get into the Romano-British period, they're fairly standard in what they like to include. Pig and chicken. If I get a cremation burial that's got pig remains and chicken remains in it, I know it's either going to be late Iron Age or more likely Romano-British. That doesn't mean to say that was all that went in there. There is, for instance, evidence, written evidence of a young boy who was cremated in Rome, who had quite a lot of his pets, his pet birds, his pet dog. They were put on the pyre with him. Now, this might sound pretty cruel and horrible, but if you have a firm belief in an afterlife, all you're doing is taking your loved pets with you to the afterlife. The Anglo-Saxon period, the early Anglo-Saxon period, they just put everything on. They like to have their horse with them, quite often their dog. So you've got status animals. You had food offerings. So you would get pig and sheep. You might get bird remains going on in there as well. But also, one of the things you get at that period are potentially amuletic. So bear claws, eagle claws, which might either have been on a fur that was wrapped around somebody that still had the claw there, or was worn as an amulet. So they are very, very distinctive in the types of animals that you're getting included in there. And this is the giveaway, from my point of view, as to the date of the burial and the cremation. Some items, such as copper alloy or glass, copper alloy, that's bronze basically, may fuse to bone on cooling and may give indications as to the layout of the corpse for burial, as in these Anglo-Saxon examples that I'm showing you here. As with the inhumation burials at this time, the women were put on their pyres in all their finery. So you've got rows of glass beads held in place by bronze brooches aside. But in this case, the bronze from the brooches had melted, leaving only the iron pins, which is why this looks a little bit feeble with its melted glass beads and its iron pins there. But those glass beads and the bronze running into little droplets, when they cool, can quite often fuse to the bone. And that fusion tends to be seen around this area of the face, on the upper part of the chest, and occasionally on the hands. Now that shows us where those items laid on the pyre. If you remember about how I said a pyre drops down gently on itself, and the fact that they're on the hands also suggests that the hands were sometimes crossed over the chest during cremation. So you can actually get quite a lot of information about what was on the pyre, how it may have been laid on the pyre in relation to the other materials around it. Now, grave goods you only really tend to see in certain periods. These are items that only went in at the time of burial. For instance, in the Romano-British period, it's quite common to get quite a lot of ceramic items going into the grave. But sometimes you also get those items going into the burial. As with this large vessel here, if you look at the CT scan of this vessel, what you could see is the level of where the level of the bone is, and it doesn't actually start until about halfway up the vessel. Above that, it was voided. There was nothing in there. However, what we can see is that there were items that were placed on top of the bone. They were grave goods. There's a greyware vessel that was placed upside down on top of the bone, and also to the other side you could see there was a ceramic dish, probably a Samian-ware dish, because I haven't excavated this yet, I can't be absolutely sure, but that's what it looks like. A Samian dish also placed on top of the bone. The other thing which only showed up in one slice of this CT image is what I think is a small glass vessel. Now that has got some separate contents in it, which I don't know what they are yet. This demonstrates that these items were only included at the time of burial. They weren't on the pyre. Also from a Romano-British period, not from our sites unfortunately, but from the Romano-British period, we have here another image showing the inclusion of jewellery on top of the bone. It's quite rare for something like jewellery to be placed in only as a grave good, because these are things that you would expect to have been laid on the body at the time of cremation. But we can see from the position of these items, the fact there's no sign of any change that would suggest they've been on the pyre. There's no change in temperature-related changes, but it was deliberately placed on top of the bone. This also looks like grave goods, not pyre goods. Adjacent to that, we've got an image of an Anglo-Saxon cremation burial, again with items that look like they have been placed directly on top of the bone. You might need to trust me on this because they're not really terribly evident, I know. That's because they're iron and they're rusted and they're very similar in colour to the soil that's around them. But we've got some tweezers and a razor there. These again look like they were placed after the bone, so they were in there as grave goods, not pyre goods. Where you get pyre goods, they tend to be intermixed amongst the cremated bone. They didn't separate it out and put them in separately when they buried them. They just collected it together with the cremated bone. So pyre goods can tell us quite a lot, as can grave goods, about the mortuary rite and the practices that were going on at that time. Another factor that I would look at is the efficiency of cremation and what that might reflect. Now, this is dependent on the three factors I talked about earlier. So temperature, oxygen plant supply, and sufficient time for the cremation to take part. Now, there are a number of potential complicating factors which might affect pyre cremation, and that includes insufficient fuel. If you don't have enough wood to burn for long enough, and we're talking probably about 3 hours or so, unlike in a modern crematoria, which is about an hour and a quarter, you need at least 3 hours in order to let the soft tissues on the body cremate. There's also, particularly in Britain, the weather. We might have an awful lot of rain, which would put the pyre out, potentially, or make your wood get so wet it's not going to burn. You might have very strong winds that force the burning to one side of the pyre and it will burn unevenly. There may be time pressures for the use of a pyre site. So there are lots of factors that can affect the efficiency of cremation, which there may have been limited control over. The analysis of the different levels of oxidation to different skeletal elements may be used to interpret the overall shortfalls or problems that occurred within individual cremations. So this might be to do with the location of the body on the pyre. If you had a small pyre, for instance, and your arms are out to the side, it's going to be cooler out there, and they might kind of just drop off to one side of the pyre. The amount of soft tissue coverage you've got, you don't have a lot of soft tissue coverage around your legs, so your shins and your feet. So the soft tissues will burn off quite soon, and the bone itself can start to burn. Whereas the central area of your body and your thighs have got a lot of soft tissues to get rid of before the bone itself can start to burn. You've got to expose the bone before it will burn. There could also be insulating materials. You might have, wrapped the head in a leather cap, which is going to insulate it. You might have wrapped part of the body in a fur, or again a leather item, which is going to insulate the body for a certain length of time. So there's lots of things that can be involved in this. And if we look at this image here, you can see what I mean. The bone this is parts of the upper limb of a fairly high status Romano British cremation burial. And you can see the black bone. The black bone is where it's not oxidized, it's still reducing conditions. There's a lot of organic components to get rid of. And the white bone is where it's fully oxidized. In this particular case, because of the areas involved, this suggests there was something insulating this part of the body. So these are the kinds of questions we might want to ask. But what we've got to remember is that full oxidation was not necessarily important in the past. What you had to have was that magic of transformation, a change from one state to another. That was what mattered, that you had that change from a corpse to something that was inert, divisible and transportable. The other area of interest is levels of fragmentation and the skeletal elements present, which can give some insights into how remains were collected from the pyre site and the formation process of the burial deposit. If we go back to looking at this image, this illustrates the amount of fragmentation that can occur in the ground due to the burial conditions. So that was the soil type and the water flow. Whilst this one displays the common myth, or at least it dismisses the common myth, that bone was deliberately broken to fit into vessels for burial. That most certainly did not occur in this case. We are looking at a large Romano British vessel. This would have been an amphora of some sort. And what they've done is you've got quite a narrow opening at the top here. As you can see, that would only have been about that round, the actual opening here. So they couldn't have get the bone through that. So what did they do? They knocked the top of the vessel, making it only a slightly larger opening. It's only about that big. But then they fed individual pieces of bone through the hole, because some of the individual pieces of bone that I got out of this vessel, and as you can see, there's a CT scan here. You can see how full that vessel was, not completely to the top, but the pieces of bone that I got out of here would only just fit through that gap. There was no soil in here, so it would be it was in the state that it would have gone in, and it would only just have fed in. This is one of the common myths that I used to read about, that, oh, bone was deliberately broken so it could be buried. I have yet to see more than maybe half a dozen out of the thousands of cremation burials that I've looked at where that might have occurred. And even then, that fragmentation could have happened as a result of a number of processes. It could be that the person curating the pyre, watching the pyre, making sure it worked, rattled the bone around slightly more than somebody else might have done, and that would break it up because it's hot, it's brittle. It might be that some people were less careful as they collected bone from the pyre. They might have just walked across the pyre, a bit naughty of them to do so, but they might have walked across the pyre a little bit more. Or bone might have been jiggled about a little bit more in a different vessel before it was put in the vessel it was finally buried in. Finally, I want to just look at the types of deposits that we find and the formation processes, because this didn't all magically get in the ground. It's not a burial, it's the remains of a burial, because a burial is an act. Somebody put it there. So how did they do it? What was potentially in their mind as they did it? These are the kinds of archaeological questions we are trying to ask. So let's look at types of deposits. Right, for instance, pyre sites. So these are the first things that we would expect to see. We don't see a lot of these because they're quite ephemeral features, unless they were protected by something afterwards, like a mound. And we do get these on Bronze Age sites where you've had a mound placed over them, over the pyre sites when they're finished with. Or you've got a cut feature. So you've got something that was underneath the pyre itself. Now, pyre sites could be flat, or you could have what I call an under-pyre draft pit, or you could have a larger pit, like we're seeing here, which is called a bustum. That's the name the Romans gave to them, bustum. That simply means that the place of burial was also the place at which the body was cremated. So you cut your pit, you construct your pyre over the top of it, and as it burns down, everything gets deposited in the pit, which then becomes the grave. To understand how the deposits within these features were laid down, i.e. the formation process, we need to analyse the remains, or the material that we get out of it, in a series of blocks and if necessary spits, so we can see where the distribution of the bone is and the distribution of the other components within it. Now, experimental examples have shown how these deposits will form. Here, for instance, on one side we have the results of an experimental pyre that I did. You can see there is a change in colour around where the pyre was. So you've got a pinky, salmon pink colour here where it's been oxidised, and it's slightly black where the wood was lying and where there would have been a cut-off in the oxygen, so we've got reducing conditions there. We can see how the material fell into the pit, how it lay up against the sides. And you can also see the charred base logs that would have formed the very base of the pyre are still laying to the sides. Now, if we look at a Romana British example, and this is from Kent, you can see here those logs, those base logs, which we could see in the experiment, have just been pushed inside the bustum, the pit itself. And in this case, they actually had scraped the bone together into a pile. So they'd still kind of made a burial, even though they'd got the pit, which was to become the grave. So we could see again something of the formation process there. At the end of the cremation, they scraped together the bone, which would have been spread about a little bit normally within that pit because of the way it collapsed. They put it together into a heap, and then they pushed the logs, the charred logs from the side, back into the grave. Another type of deposit is pyre debris, redeposited pyre debris, i.e. material that didn't just lay on the pyre site. Now, it might not look very exotic, but it can contain a wealth of information. If you bear in mind I said they didn't bury all the bone or the pyre goods, then quite a lot of that material could remain with the other pyre debris, and its deposition is part of the mortuary rite. It really is quite a common occurrence. We find it in a number of different locations. For instance, it's most commonly found in the backfills of graves. So when they've made the burial, they then add some of the pyre debris as well. And the fact they've added the pyre debris suggests that the burial has taken place close to the location of the cremation itself. It's close to the pyre site. You might collect and curate, move around your bag or container, whatever container it was, of bone, cremated bone, but you're not going to cart a load of pyre debris around with you as well. So it's quite common in the backfills of cremation graves. It can also be a formal deposit on its own. And if you remember me saying earlier about one individual can be found spread between different types of deposit, we have found joins between bone from a grave with bone from pyre debris found in an adjacent pit. That makes it clear that they had derived from the same cremation. In the Romano-British period, you might find it heaped in a certain area of the cemetery where the cremations took place, which are known as ostrina. And you might also find it redeposited, as in some of these images here, in a Bronze Age barrow ditch, again suggesting the pyres themselves were held inside the confines of the ring ditch, and the debris was dropped into the ditch from the inside. We can say from the angle of deposition that's what's happened there. Or you may get deposits made in another area, for instance this Romano-British rectangular enclosure, where burials were made in the upper fill of the ditch and the pyre debris was deposited around it. Again, the distribution of that pyre debris suggests the pyres themselves were off to the west side of that enclosure. Burials, of course, represent the most commonly recovered deposit type. Now, burials are made, and we need to try and understand their formation process. Urn burials, all periods, we get different types of vessels. I discussed a bit about that earlier. When these vessels were buried, they would always have been lidded. You can get different types of lid, and we do have surviving evidence. Because of that truncation that occurs quite often, you get it lost and you lose that evidence. But we know from excavation, careful excavation and recovery of both inverted vessels, because sometimes they were buried upside down, material didn't all fall out of them, and we can see from how the bone lays in relationship to the vessel that it did have some kind of either skin, textile or other kind of organic lid into which that bone has sort of dropped and formed a concave surface. You can also get stones, large stones. You can get other vessels. Sometimes in the Romano-British period, another vessel would be placed in the mouth of the urn. We have a very rare occurrence, very rare survival of lumps of clay being used to plug the opening of the neck of a vessel. But one of the things that has become evident, and if we look at this image, this demonstrates it, is that material wasn't always put straight into a vessel. It wasn't always put straight into the burial vessel. This image here, and I'm getting more and more evidence for this, is that bone in the Bronze Age was originally placed in a bag, and then the bag was placed inside a vessel. In this particular case here, the CT scan, and again I took a CT scan of it, showed there were two bags of bone, and you can see the line of division here where the upper bag, you can see it more clearly on the CT scan where I could look at it from lots of different angles, but I've drawn the line where there was a change, where there was a gap, a slight gap between one bag of material and a second bag of material. And when I came to excavate that, I found that continued. What I found matched this. And the bag that is in the lower part of the vessel, which actually would have been the second bag to go in, contained the remains of a child, whereas the bag in the upper part of the vessel, which would actually have gone in first because this was inverted, were the remains of a teenager. Now, how long that bone remained above ground before it eventually got placed in this vessel and buried, we don't currently know, but we're looking at finding an answer to that one, because that would be quite exciting. Like I said, cremated bones can be curated for any length of time before they are finally buried. Unurned burials that we get, we can see from the distribution of the bone that it is normally contained in some way. It would have been contained within some kind of organic bag, basket, whatever. This quite often gets difficult to interpret because pyre debris, which is put on top of the burial remains, will infiltrate down between the bones in these unurned burials, and we have to excavate them in a particular way that enables us to see the distribution in greater detail when I come to do the analysis. There are myriad other possibilities, of course, for crematorium-related deposits to exist, and some we do have good evidence for. For instance, you may get a token deposit. This is a word that gets bandied about quite a lot, but my definition of a token deposit is one or two bones from a second individual that have been curated and kept and then are included in the burial of a second individual. This image here shows what I have termed memento mori type deposits or memento mortis type deposits. These are sort of these are slightly larger tokens. They are mementos of somebody who died earlier. And these are very interesting actually, because these are from an Anglo-Saxon cemetery where you had inhumation burials made, but placed on top of the body, the inhumed body, was a small package containing cremated bone. At some point in the future, I hope we will be able to do more detailed radiocarbon dating of the two, the inhumed individual and the cremated individual, in order to be able to see how big a gap there was between the person dying and being cremated and the person going into the ground as a corpse. Basically, they would be carrying those remains around with them. It's not that weird. I actually have some of my papa's bones from when he was cremated. We had an agreement, and I kept those, and they will go with me when I eventually go. And that is a lovely thought, the fact that we can be together forever. What a wonderful idea. Of course, the other thing you might get are what we call cenotaphs. This is where something looks more, well, it looks like a grave. It's got all the things in it that suggest it's a grave. It might even have a tiny amount of cremated bone in it, but it's so tiny, we're talking about a few grams, that it quite clearly was not the place of burial. In these cases, the suggestion is that somebody died and was cremated in one place, and they had to make some kind of monument to them at that place. But actually, most of the remains were just taken away for burial elsewhere, perhaps transporting to the place they originally came from. We do have evidence for this, for instance, in the northern frontier forts of the Roman periods, where we have bustum type graves with pyre debris in, very small quantities of bone, grave goods of ceramic items, but the quantity of bone is minuscule. And I think in those cases, the remains of those dead have been taken back to where those soldiers came from, possibly continental Europe or somewhere else there. But what we must always remember is that the dead did not cease to serve the living, or the living to commune with the dead. The dead are always with us. They may be in our memories, they may be in our hearts, but also people kept them within their vision and sometimes within their lives. And this is one of the joys of doing archaeology and working with mortuary archaeology, is trying to understand what people thought and what the dead meant to them.
Well, everyone, thank you so much for watching that. I'm sure you agree that the end of that was a very personal and very touching way to finish that lecture there. Please do send us your questions. You can also email engagement@wessexarch.co.uk. But right now it's time to go to our third lecture of the day, which is the Geoarchaeology of HS2. And you can pick the link up to that in the chat box. Thanks very much, everyone. Goodbye.